At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
A Fascinate Productions podcast for drug science.
Hello, I'm David Nutt and welcome to another Drug Science podcast. Today we have David Luke, who's a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Greenwich, and he's one of the pioneers of psychedelic research in the UK. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, David. Nice to be here.
It's good to have you on board. And it's interesting that you are a lecturer in psychology, but you're interested in psychedelics. Has there ever been any conflict between your department and you in terms of what you do?
No, not especially. I always thought there might be some, frowning going on here and there, but never really witnessed any resistance to it. When I finally kind of came out of the closet about my research interests, I got a lot of kind of curious knocks on the door of people who are kind of, oh, that's really interesting. So I think secretly people are quite interested in this research area.
Well, yeah, I think we sort of found the same, when we started doing our clinical work, people weren't overtly positive, but, they behind the scenes, people were saying, well done, keep it up, They just didn't want to put their head above the parapet. So,
Exactly.
So when did you start getting an interest? Can you tell us a bit about your background and how your career developed?
Sure. I started off, I was always interested in kind of altered states from a young age, and actually went to study psychology because of my interest, but was kind of woefully disappointed with the little kind of attention that was given in psychology to these different states of consciousness, and ran screaming from the academy, actually. And they asked me back to teach. And I ended up going into a PhD, kind of exploring transpersonal experiences, because at that time, that was the kind of closest field you could go into, I think, and explore these states of consciousness, I felt, rather than psychopharmacology.
So what does that mean? I mean, this concept of transpersonal, that's a word that many of our listeners won't understand.
So, in its basic form, it just means those experiences which take you transpersonal, beyond your personal ego identity, so that you feel you have a deeper connection with something other, maybe another person or another species, or a feeling of love and awe or interconnectedness with the universe, or just something beyond your own everyday ego sense, if you like.
And this is a construct that is it recent in terms of people talking about it, or is it old?
Well, in terms of people talking about it, perhaps. It's always been a bit kind of left of field within psychology. William James, the father of American psychology, coined the term, but it wasn't until the 1960s, actually, that people like Stanislav Grof and Maslow and James Fadiman picked up on this notion and, created the field of transpersonal psychology, if you like. So it's been around a while.
Yeah, but in terms of sort of getting into academic discourse, I guess it's relatively recent. And how does that sort of map onto other thinking about consciousness? Is it a different form of consciousness, or is it an extension of consciousness? How do you put it in the sort of framework of consciousness thought and thinking and theory?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, what do we actually understand by what is consciousness in the first place? So these experiences are within the realm of consciousness, but they're just not ordinary, everyday kind of experiences, and that they may have kind of profound concomitants and knock-on after effects, such as that people maybe have a less fear of death, may become more empathic or community-minded or more ecologically minded. And so these are profound experiences. Typically, if they progress in their best way, that can have profound effects on the person's individual personality. So I think you can look at it like that. They're within the field of consciousness, but they're just a little bit unusual and uncommon.
So why do they occur then? Is it always drugs, or can other things bring them on?
Well, that's where my research is directed into. I mean, certainly as we're discovering, as you're discovering with all this wonderful research, psychedelics are, particularly of all classes of drugs, very good at inducing transpersonal experiences. And yet, from various ancient traditions around the world and even modern day practices, we know that perhaps any old state of consciousness or altered state of consciousness will do for getting you into a kind of transpersonal realm. Although, psychedelic drugs seem to be a lot more reliable at inducing these experiences, but it's often a kind of bit of a sledgehammer for a nut, perhaps, in that, you could equally have these experiences through just some kind of prolonged meditation or perhaps some yogic practices or time spent in a dark room or something like that.
Yeah, I remember one of the things most fascinated me when I was starting to do psychology in university was with a flotation tank. People, you lie people flat in warm water and suddenly, after a few minutes, things are very different. And of course, that's now been reconstructed as explaining the fact that our brain creates the environment, and when it's got no input, it creates its own environment.
And I think for me, the interest lies in what are the relationship between these other non-drug, non-psychedelic states of consciousness and how they map to what we're now discovering, which is, moving forward in a very fast way about psychedelic drugs and their understanding of their action in the brain and the psychopharmacology of those. And can we apply some of that neuropsychopharmacology to non-drug altered states of consciousness as well?
It'd be quite interesting, challenging, but interesting to scan someone in a flotation tank. I can't quite work out how we do it without fusing all the MRI stuff. But there's also this concept of putting people in an anechoic chamber. Do you want to explain to people what that's about?
Yeah, so these anechoic chambers were initially built for engineering and acoustics and studying the properties of sound or the absence of sound and sonic devices in acoustically isolated environments. But people doing research in those environments found that they'd often have quite strange experiences inside the anechoic chamber. Mm-hmm. So they suck out all the timber out of the air, these chambers. So not only is there no sound coming in from the outside, but all the sounds created within it are also extremely deadened. So there's kind of actually negative decibels inside a chamber. And if you combine that with it also being pitch black, kind of seal it off, and so there's no light coming in as well, you have a very unique sensory deprivation chamber with the absence of sound and light. So we did an experiment as kind of art-science collaboration where people volunteered, I should say, to go inside the chamber for 2 hours or so at a time. And we found when you use the same kind of measures you use with people on psychedelics, the altered states of consciousness scale and so on, people have experiences which are very similar to psychedelic experiences on paper, at least with the psychometrics.
Interesting.
And a few other features pop up as well. So like sensed presence, for instance, was quite common.
Really? Oh, the sort of same kind of sensed presence as you might get from DMT?
Yeah, well, on paper, certainly there's the same kind. I mean, an experience of sensed presence, though typically they weren't the fully formed geometric praying mantis aliens or whatever you might get with DMT. Yeah. These were more just a sense of there's something else or someone else in the room with me. And it was very apparent. And in 90% of those cases, they also felt it was quite ominous, which was interesting and perhaps gives us some insight into maybe things like sleep paralysis, where these experiences also occur. So
no, that's really, actually, that's interesting. Yes, as a clinician, I used to run a sleep clinic, and sleep paralysis is a really unpleasant disorder, and that's the first time I've ever heard of it. Well, thanks for sharing that with me. Pity the clinic's closed, but I'll think about it. And then there's this concept of holotropic breathwork. What is that?
So this was actually a technique developed by Stanislav Grof, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, who was a psychiatrist and was the kind of pioneer of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And when, of course, Prohibition came in the 1960s, he had to stop his work with psychedelics and develop this technique, which he trademarked, called holotropic breathing, which is essentially a simple hyperventilation technique of over-breathing, but done along the same principles of you might do a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy session. So people are wearing eye shades, they've got very loud and evocative music playing, but they're going into this kind of over-breathing technique of hyperventilation, which induces an altered state of consciousness, quite this kind of dreamy state, some amount of perhaps abreaction where there's unconscious material coming up to the conscious mind, and people are often exploring previous traumas or buried memories or having insights about various personal and interpersonal kind of psychological dimensions of their own history. Interestingly, that holotropic breathwork technique, although it's been studied clinically quite a lot for years, nobody's really explored it as an altered state of consciousness in the same way we explore psychedelics again. So we have all these lovely measures of the psychedelic space and the predictor variables, but not of these other non-drug altered states, which have been around for years, but no one studied them in a kind of pure kind of consciousness way.
So that's your research. You're trying to look at the overlap, similarities, dissimilarities, and I mean, in terms of, do they have? Well, you've kind of touched on the holotropic potentially allowing memories, suppressed memories to go up. So, but can they all be therapeutic? Do you think, or is that one of the questions you're addressing?
Well, I'm not so interested in the clinical side. I mean, I think it's really important, obviously, but my own research direction is not particularly clinically focused, although I keep an eye on that, and that's one of the things we'd like to explore. A lot of that research has been done, so all of these altered states seem to have some therapeutic potential, and often that's how they've been used. But, I'm more exploring it from the dimension of how do they relate to other altered states of consciousness. I mean, holotropic breathwork has been used therapeutically for many years already, and you can probably find reviews of the clinical efficacy of that out there, although it probably hasn't been done in a kind of standardized, placebo-controlled, randomized way.
It's a funny thing, though, because when I was running an anxiety disorders clinic, one of the diagnostic tests we used to use in people who had panic disorder was get them to hyperventilate, and they just couldn't. Within 10 breaths, they were panicking. So it's fascinating that hyperventilation can produce a profoundly different state depending on what, I guess, your base, your vulnerability to anxiety or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually. In the 1950s and 60s, that one of the things, when they were obviously working in a kind of non-clinical context, a bit more, things were a bit easier and freer back then. One of the main people kind of distributing LSD at the time would pre-test people for how they would respond by giving them carbogen, which is a mixture of carbon dioxide and oxygen, which gives you a very short but intense altered state of consciousness, And if people really freaked out, he decided not to give them LSD as a consequence. So he used it as a kind of yardstick testing ground for how they would react to this intense altered state. But interestingly, I mean, I don't know if holotropic breathwork particularly works along the same principles as carbogen as such, Carbogen, you're having a massive increase in the amount of carbon dioxide you're inhaling, whereas in hyperventilation, you're getting an increase in oxygen. So they seem to work in very different ways physiologically, but the end result is that people get into these often profound altered states of consciousness. I think the underlying physiology of those experiences deserves to be explored more as well in terms of what we can learn about consciousness in the brain.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Although, again, it's difficult because you change blood flow. When you're using MR methodology, correcting for changes in blood flow is really quite challenging. But maybe EEG or MEG would be a way forward for that. But your particular research is to collect subjective data and try to make sense of the different experiences through subjective questionnaires and that. In
this regard, in this particular project of mapping out states, subjective experience and the phenomenology of that, taking primarily a psychometric approach. I do some kind of more behavioral experimental stuff as well, exploring things like synesthesia. But this particular project is exploring the more psychometric angles. But
you see synesthesia as an altered state of consciousness as well. It's a more holistic consciousness. I mean, explain to the listeners what synesthesia is first, in case they don't know.
So synesthesia is actually a natural condition, we can say. I mean, it's not pathological typically, but a small percentage of the population actually have synesthesia congenitally, whereby there is a blending of the senses in which you may see sounds or taste colours or have colours associated with numbers or letters or days of the week and so on and so forth. So you have a kind of combined sensory experience where one thing that an inducer will also have a concurrent sensory experience which people who don't have synesthesia ordinarily get. So that's a congenital condition, let's say, amongst a small percent of the population. However, what we find is people on psychedelics, for instance, very often have this experience. And so the really interesting question is, can our study of psychedelic-induced synesthesia tell us something about the underlying neurobiology of congenital synesthesia, and therefore about consciousness itself, how experiences become combined?
Where do you start this idea that the whole purpose of education and development and growing up is about stopping your brain doing the clever things it used to do when you're a child? Are you sympathetic to that view, that it's about breaking down the capacity of the brain and making it much more limited and rigid? Do you think that's what growing up's about?
It feels like it. I mean, I guess to some extent, because, I mean, if you take the example of synesthesia again, so we know that there are a number of people, and I was one myself. I had synesthesia when I was young, but it desisted at a certain point. So it's it's partially developmental, because often some of the experiences you have are linked to developmental indices like reading, letters, numbers, days of the week, time. We're not born knowing about those things, and yet you can get very specific colours become attached to those. And some people go on to develop it, but some people have it in their youth and then not carry it through into adulthood. Whereas those people who have adult synesthesia have had it their whole life. So in some respects, we may be restricting certain abilities and tendencies through the way we socialise and educate children. It's a possibility, definitely.
Do you think it's a special sort of trait? Do you think it contributes potentially to art or creativity? Because some people talk about altered consciousness as having a value in that sense.
Well, there are a lot of good examples of famous artists and musicians who've used their synesthesia in their creativity. And it's generally kind of considered that synesthetes may be more creative. But, there's obviously a lot of discussion around that in the research literature. Certainly people can use their synesthesia in very creative ways, as they can with their other anomalous or exceptional experiences that occur in psychedelics, such as for the use of creative problem solving. What we're beginning to understand is that altered states, such as through the use of psychedelics, can be very good at inducing what we call divergent thinking, but at the same time reducing convergent thinking, which is our everyday logical linear way of solving problems. They're very good at creating new solutions, very novel, sometimes kind of a bit wacky or nonsensical kind of solutions to existing problems. But the fact is they give us this kind of a fresh creative perspective on old problems quite often.
Yeah, and I guess that's why governments are so terrified of them, why they were banned. Is that would you agree?
Well, I think that's probably at least one of the reasons, I would say. Yeah, I'm sure there's many reasons. It is a curious thing why they are so terrified of them when they have so much potential for all manner of positive uses within society, not least clinically in terms of psychiatry and mental health, but in a non-clinical context as well, in terms of improving creativity, relationships, empathy, creative problem solving, ecological consciousness, so on. We're forever finding more potential benefits to these extraordinary states.
We'll get back to the interview in just a second. I just want to thank all the drug science community members for your continued support. Without you, the dissemination of information like this would not be possible. Drug science is, and always will be, independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. But by becoming a drug science community member, you'll be helping us bring about change. You'll also receive access to exclusive events and will be able to attend all drug science events for free. To see how to become a community member, click on the link in the show notes. Now, where were we? Let's get back to the show. Well, let's stick with the last one, ecological. That's a new term. So I was at just for the listeners who you haven't mentioned it, but you were one of the founders, and I think still are one of the great drivers of Breaking Convention, which is a conference that happens, I think, is it still every year?
It's every 2 years. It takes us a year to recover.
Yeah. So this is a conference which you hold in your own university down in the beautiful, beautiful campus at Greenwich. And I was there last year, and it was fascinating to hear some of the leaders of Extinction Rebellion talking about how their sympathy, their sort of realization that we were in a really difficult place and had to change came from their own psychedelic experience. Is that what you mean by ecological consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. So, the research that myself and a few others have been doing, some of the research coming out of Imperial has found that people having psychedelic experiences often feel that they become more ecologically orientated as a result of their experience. And we find this with kind of so-called recreational use, and even in the laboratory, people having psychedelics in a lab setting still have an increase in what we call biophilia. They have an increased kind of desire to be in nature and deeper connection with nature purely for their psychedelic experience. So, in this kind of current ecological crisis that we're in and the sixth wave of mass extinction on the planet, this can be quite crucial and critical in helping people who are increasingly urbanized into being more drawn to appreciate and care for and have concern for nature, which is, not a small thing, really.
No, indeed. But it's impressive how I suppose it's one of the features of certainly of psychedelic and maybe the other altered states of consciousness, how they can often be directive in the sense that they can show people a path to do things that they didn't previously think they should do, and give them the motivation and the drive to do it. And good luck to them, because we certainly need that kind of leadership, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting to know what the kind of drivers for that are, exactly. I mean, it seems to be kind of generally speaking, there's an increased sense of connectivity on, every level, from the biological to the cosmic, isn't it? There's an increased kind of connectivity within the brain, within the regions, psychologically with yourself, sociologically with other people, enhanced empathy, and so on, and also with the environment, and then on up into, spiritual or kind of astronomical realms as well, But how do we kind of conceptualize that pharmacologically?
Well, I conceptualize it by the value of, or the purpose of these receptors is to allow you to think differently. We're thinking, why does the brain have so many of these serotonin 2A receptors in the parts of the brain which do the important thinking? And I think it's got to be something to do with making you think differently. And it may be when humanity gets to major challenges, like the environmental disaster we're facing, that those receptors can help people think and come up with new solutions and behave differently. And they may be fundamental to the nature of human growth and understanding and insight. The brain, at one level is a chemical organ, and it's got to be more receptors which actually mediate those kind of altered states of consciousness. And the 2A receptor is certainly the most obvious when we have it present, and we know it certainly is the one through which psychedelics work. And that's what I find fascinating about it, because it's completely orthogonal to conventional consciousness, which is kind of, are you awake, are you asleep, do you remember it? The serotonergic drugs make you think differently. That's why I'm interested in it, because it's a way of probing consciousness. And you've obviously come to it from a consciousness perspective. I've come to it from a pharmacological perspective. But we're both in the same space pretty much, aren't we?
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you ever sort of begin to sort of rub shoulders with religious beliefs? Do you think your research helps people understand that?
To some extent, yes. One of the interesting things we find from psychedelics, I think, and other altered states and practices into exploring one's own consciousness is people tend to be less religious and kind of turn themselves spiritual. So they're kind of people moving away from classic monotheistic religious beliefs perhaps, and moving into more kind of agnostic or other areas. The recent research they've been doing at Hopkins, they found that people had profound experiences with DMT, either encounters with God or encounters with entities of some kind. The majority of people who called themselves atheists before would categorize themselves as being non-atheist afterwards. And this could be after one 10-minute experience of DMT, which is, extremely profound, but typically not towards a classic organized religion, more towards a kind of, I'm a non-atheist, I'm not quite sure what I am, maybe agnostic, maybe spiritual, but something other. So I think it definitely does come up against religious belief, but not in the classic way, perhaps.
I remember this great quote from Paul McCartney after he took DMT. He said, "I'm not sure I saw God, but I knew there was something more to life."
I think he got in a lot of trouble for that, didn't he?
But what about things like precognition and telepathy? I mean, do you see are they in the same sort of arena, or are they experiences as opposed to changes in I mean, tell us about them and why you're interested in them.
Sure. I mean, so I classify these as exceptional experiences again, and people often have them, a lot of people will have an experience like that at some point in their life, but they're not very common. But, over the course of a lifetime, the majority of people will have one experience where they say, oh yeah, I had this dream, and then sure enough, the next day something happened which was very like the dream. Or, Granny turns up at 3:00 in the morning and starts waving, saying goodbye, and then the next day they find out that Granny died at 3:00 in the morning. And so, these occur, but not very often, but enough that people have these experiences. But we find in altered states of consciousness, such as with psychedelics or dreams, and in fact, most of these experiences tend to occur in some kind of altered state. Now, that doesn't mean we can just offhand reject them as being some kind of hallucination. And when we begin to explore these by doing, controlled experiments, we find that we can get reliable effects, even though the effect sizes are very small. When you stack them up over time, we can find, small positive increments above what we might expect to find by chance alone when we get people to try and access some kind of information from the future, and especially when they're in an altered state of consciousness, or when you get them to not think about what they're doing at all and just look at their physiological responses, such as their galvanic skin resistance responds to emotional or neutral images, which then are coming up in the future. That there's a kind of pre-anticipation. So there's lots of good data, I'd say, that has been gathered over the years showing that there are very small but perceptible effects where we seem to be able to access information from the future in a way which does not rely on inference.
Well, this is quite complicated. So can you maybe just explain how an experiment like that would work, please?
Okay, so I give you the example of my experience I've been doing with people under the influence of psychedelics and not. So they are told to try and visualize a target, which will be a 1-minute video clip. They don't know the contents of it. There'd just be a 1-minute video clip from a movie. They come up with some kind of visualization, which we record, and then they're shown 4 1-minute video clips, and they have to then say, well, it was a little bit like this one, not much like that one, a lot like this one. And so they rank order the 4 video clips they see relative to their visualization. And then a random number generator will then decide what the actual target was. So this is completely independent. It's somewhat abstract, but it's also, independent, and there's no possibility of them beyond pure statistics, probability of guessing what the random number generator is going to select. And yet we find that there is a kind of positive deviation, that they get the target more often than chance.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, and we've just published a paper from the data from the Global Drug Survey. We asked a question. In our early psilocybin experiments, we had a few people that were colorblind, and they said they could see colors better afterwards. And of course, when I spoke to my physiology friends, they said that's impossible because color blindness is in the retina. But so we put a question into the Global Drug Survey, and turned out that about 50 people answered it. A significant number of people do see colours better after psychedelics, and sometimes that's enduring. And these are colourblind people, and it opens up your mind to the fact that the mind is doing a lot more than just processing what's coming in through your eyes, which is clearly what you're discovering as well. I kind of interpret it a bit as again, as we touched on earlier, a lot of what the mind does is stop you doing things. Because the brain's a lazy organ. It just wants you to look, come on, get this work done, get back home, feed me and sleep me. Whereas if you start fantasizing about the future and changing your perception of worlds, the brain gets irritated. Which of course, which is I guess what Huxley was talking about with the brain is a device for limiting the mind. Would you agree with him?
I think that, there's some value in what Huxley said. I mean, it's very, very simplistic, kind of neuropharmacologically speaking. But, in essence, I think there's a lot of value in this idea that the brain acts to just kind of keep things as ordered as possible and filter out what isn't just completely necessary, and tries to make as many shortcuts as possible. And then psychedelics have this action of turning off that reducing valve of the brain, as Huxley called it, and just opening you up to a whole wealth of sensory experience, which you wouldn't ordinarily have. But yeah, these perceptual anomalies are very interesting. I've been getting interested in aphantasia, where people have no mental imagery, and how they respond to psychedelics. And also...
Sorry, tell us a bit more about that. I've never heard of aphantasia.
So it's only recently had a name, which is extraordinary. And it's one of those things when as soon as you give it a name, loads of people go and it becomes public knowledge. Everybody goes, oh, I've got that. I didn't realise there was anything different about me, So as people who have no mental visual imagery whatsoever, if you get them to try and visualise an elephant, close their eyes and see an elephant, they just don't see anything. It's just black. Don't tell me you've got aphantasia, David. Can you see an elephant?
I can. Yes, I'm working on it. Carry on.
Okay. And so these people, they just assume when other people are talking about visualizing things, they're speaking metaphorically. But then they discover, actually, no, they're in maybe a small percentage, maybe 1 or 2% of people who have no mental imagery, visual imagery whatsoever. So the curious thing is, well, what happens when we give them extremely potent psychedelics?
That is very interesting. And what does happen?
Well, so it seems so far in the case of most people don't see anything still, even like extremely potent DMT experiences. They get all the other effects, but they just don't get any visual effects. Whereas we have found that there's one case of a person who had aphantasia since his childhood, but then was able to see a mental imagery after his ayahuasca experience. But it seems that he probably had some kind of functional aphantasia. So there seems to be a difference. Yeah. His seemed to be induced at a young age by trauma as opposed to being born with it. So, there's a lot we can learn about consciousness and imagery and so forth as well. And
have you ever worked with hypnosis? Because that's an interestingly ordered state. I guess that might appeal to you.
It's on my list. It's on my to-do list, David. I am planning to do some hypnotic regression with people who've had psychedelic experiences and then see how much of the experience we can recreate purely through hypnotic suggestion. Obviously, suggestibility is going to be a factor, but I think, that has a lot of potential in maybe helping us understand some of the underlying neurobiology, and also potentially in having some utility clinically as well. If people are having remission from depression on their first psilocybin experience, but then the experience wanes, do we necessarily want to have to keep giving them psilocybin, or could we look to explore re-inducing the experience through, hypnosis or something like that?
You think you might be able to do that? That's some news to me, and that's fascinating. I've never thought about that. So.
There were a couple of papers back in the 60s where they managed, and Arthur Hastings again a few years later, but there's only been about 2 or 3 studies when they managed to re-induce full-blown psychedelic experiences. People said it was like a 9 out of 10 on terms of their psychedelic experience.
Well, yeah, but the majority of people do remember their psychedelic experiences, so they're there somewhere. I mean, there's a circuit which has encoded them. And reading some old literature, in the beginning of the 1900s on hypnosis, and individuals who had been hypnotized were able to do things like remember objects or directions with a precision way better than they could when they were unhypnotized. Again, suggesting that when you get your subcortical brain is actually a pretty sophisticated brain. It just gets blocked out by your cortex.
The cortex can get in the way sometimes, no?
Well, yeah, I think that's its purpose, isn't it? Again, I mean, at one level, yeah. I mean, most creatures manage to live pretty well without much of a cortex. Dogs, my dogs are much more emotional and much more in tune with the world than I am. They don't have anything like the huge cortical influences over their emotions that we do. What about what does your work help us think about disorders like schizophrenia, where you've got altered states of consciousness which are kind of destructive and potentially, harmful to the person or to others?
I think it's interesting, and I think there is a lot to learn. And obviously, psychedelics, when they're first new to psychiatry, they were thought of as psychotomimetic, in that they would mimic a psychotic experience. And I think there's some things that can be learned, but I think that, there's not a one-to-one overlap or model. of schizophrenia to a psychedelic experience, say. I mean, and they kind of differ in perhaps, I mean, obviously you can get delusional with psychedelics, but in terms of the hallucinations, typically, in my understanding, schizophrenia is more auditory hallucinations, whereas psychedelics are very visual. And it's not a hard and fast rule, but I think there's something that can be learned. What I think would be really interesting to explore is those experiences where people do develop prolonged psychosis triggered by a psychedelic experience, and how that is similar or different to classic psychosis. Then again, it's hard to tease apart, is the psychedelic inducing the psychosis, or is it just activating an underlying psychosis? And, the epidemiology would suggest it's just triggering an underlying psychosis in a lot of cases. So, there's something to be learned there, but I don't think that there's a one-to-one map between these old states and schizophrenia, for instance.
Well, of course, that gets to the question of cannabis. I mean, have you ever worked with cannabis, which is a sort of halfway house to between? It's an altered state of consciousness. It's not as profound, obviously, as a psychedelic, but it's definitely a real change. Have you ever worked in that space?
No, I've not been so interested in cannabis in my career. Although I think it certainly can be psychedelic. It's not a classic psychedelic as in being serotonergic in that way, but it is. I mean, the experiences at the right dosage or the right individual can be very psychedelic-like, and it might be that we can learn more, perhaps, from psychosis from cannabis, perhaps in terms of the more of the kind of experiences it can produce. I mean, it seems has a good tendency to induce paranoia, certainly in a certain number of people. Perhaps these stronger strains of cannabis that you have these days without CBD, there's like nature somehow seems to know best and has inbuilt checks and balances, and we've gone along and go, oh great, let's just ramp up the THC and really then ramp up the paranoia and delusions as well. So
you've been working in this field for 20 years now, maybe more. I don't know. Yeah. And how is the rest of psychology catching up, or are you still a bit of an anomaly?
Well, I think I'm still a bit of an anomaly. I hope so, or I'll have to change career direction. But it certainly has changed drastically since I started out in my own interests. I mean, you couldn't really even study psychedelics 20 years ago, and now of course it's a hot button topic and everybody wants to do it. I think some of the more exceptional experiences are still sidelined a bit, but we're starting to see those being explored more, and I think that's really important and useful, because if we're exploring this terrain, we want to include the full spectrum of human consciousness in these experiences. A, for what we can learn about the nature of consciousness and human experience, but also B, for their potential in helping people deal with these experiences if and when they do have them, which, if people are going to have psychedelic therapy or psychedelic experiences, they probably will. So we need to really better understand them and be prepared to kind of help people integrate those experiences, I think. But yeah, it's catching up.
You think we'll have a discipline of psychedelic psychology maybe you're even teaching that course, are you?
I am actually, but it's taken a long while. The education rather lags behind the science, unfortunately. I've just started teaching a course as part of an online master's on psychedelics within a master's course on transpersonal psychology. But as far as I know, there's no other taught courses anywhere in the country, in the UK, or anywhere in Europe, I know of, that teaches courses on psychedelics or psychedelic psychology, or even psychedelic pharmacology, psychopharmacology particularly. And yet there's all this kind of burgeoning research coming through. So there's definitely an educational lacuna there, which demands to be addressed.
Well, David, I'm impressed that you've got a master's, and if ever you want someone to come and talk about the neuroscience of psychedelics, feel free to invite me.
I would absolutely love that, David. I'll take you up on that. Thank you. Yes.
Well, it's been really great talking to you today, David. Our time is up, and thanks again, and keep up the good work. You're definitely a pioneer, and thanks very much indeed. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That was a race through all sorts of altered states of consciousness, including psychedelics. And David has clearly been one of the pioneers of thinking about how we can integrate these different states of mind into a theory of consciousness and also use it to help people think about how to help people and also develop new treatments. So I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. If you have, please share it. Please follow me on Twitter. Please follow Drug Science on Twitter. And ideally, please become a member of the Drug Science community, because Drug Science is a charity that relies on donations from people like you. And if you sign up to the community, then you'll get opportunities to attend Drug Science meetings, get our publications in advance, and most importantly, support our important work in terms of delivering the truth about drugs to the general public. Thank you for listening.